Hello, BookTube. I've been in the month of July reading J.R.R. Tolkien's The Silmarillion with Scott Danielson and David Wiley as part of our Summer of the Silmarils. This is the bits and pieces, some long, some shorter, the fragmentary backdrop, mytho-historical backdrop of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. That Tolkien worked on some parts of this for his whole life. These are the ancient stories that undergird the world of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. If you read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, then you know that you're in the Third Age, and that The Lord of the Rings brings down the curtain on the Third Age of the world. The Silmarillion is the First and Second Age of the world. Not told at all in the way of Lord of the Rings, told much more in the way of Roman annals or the rolling diction of the King James Bible. Where it's the storytelling rather than the characters and the dialogue and the turns of specific events. That's what you get in Lord of the Rings. That's not what you get here, and that leads in the final part of this book that we're reading today to an utterly fascinating writing exercise. But we'll get to that. First, we are arriving at the end of the Second Age here. The world of Middle-earth has been ruled for a long time, terrorized for a long time by Melkor, who is one of the Valar, one of the gods. All the other gods live in the extreme west of Middle-earth in Valinor. They are separated from the rest of the world by forbidding ocean passage. It's not possible for people to get there anymore. Some elves live with them, but most of the elves retreated or came back to Middle-earth where they were born, including especially the Noldor, a tribe of elves that are extremely willful, extremely masterful. And among the elves that come to Middle-earth, I guess to contest it with Melkor, who wants to rule Middle-earth, are the sons of Fëanor, who are guarding three magical MacGuffins called the Silmarils, hence the title of the book. Three gems that are surpassingly beautiful, and that were created by Fëanor. And the sons of Fëanor view them as their own property, and have taken an awful, horrible vow, a vow that none had ever made and none ever should make, calling on all the powers of Varda and Manwë, calling on all the powers of the Valar, and saying that anyone who wants to hold or possess or keep or take a Silmaril is their sworn enemy, that these things belong to them and no one else. And that oath darkens a lot of the Silmarillion. Because the sons of Fëanor, they get picked off one by one as time goes on and they engage in various battles with Melkor and his forces. But the oath drives them ever onward. And things get darker and darker. There are hidden realms like Gondolin where beauty and valor and peace could flourish for a long time, but one by one Melkor finds them and destroys them. Melkor's forces behind the walls of his great headquarters in Angband have been growing and growing. Orcs without number, dragons, and Balrogs, and those forces eventually reach a point where they overrun the whole of the north of Arda and are almost unopposable. And this creates a lamentable state of affairs. And at one point in the chapters that we're reading today, a character named Earendel, a mortal man, looks on this lamentable state of affairs and says, enough is enough. We need help. This world has gone to ruin. And if the gods, all the way to the west in Valinor, knew about it, they would help us. And Earendel has in his possession a Silmaril. The Silmaril that Beren cut from the crown of Melkor in the tale of Beren and Luthien. He attaches that Silmaril to the prow of his vessel and goes sailing to the west. And it turns out the Silmaril is the passage that's needed to get him to Valinor. He goes to Valinor in order to plead the case for both the Noldor and men, to plead the case of Middle-earth, to beg for relief from the oppression of Melkor. And his prayer is granted. So I want to there are some passages that I want to read you. Let's see here. And a couple of those passages deal with Earendel. let's see here. We get the fall of Gondolin. We get the battle between a character named Glorfindel and a Balrog. But really, we get to Earendel. Let's see here. Yet Earendel saw now no hope left in the lands of Middle-earth, and he turned again in despair and came not home, but sought back once more to Valinor, with Elwing, his wife, at his side. He stood now most often at the prow of Vingalot, that's his great ship, and the Silmaril was bound upon his brow, and ever its light grew greater as they drew west. And the wise have said that it was by reason of the power of that holy jewel that they came in time to waters no vessel save those of the Teleri had ever known. And they came to the enchanted isles and escaped their enchantment. And they came to the shadowy seas and passed their shadows. And they looked upon tall Iressa, the lonely isle, but tarried not. And at last they came to anchor in the bay of Eldamar. And the Teleri saw the coming of that ship out of the east, and they were amazed, gazing from afar upon the light of the Silmaril, and it was very great. And Earendil then, first of living men, landed on the immortal shores. And he spoke then to Elring and to those who were watching him, that I will go alone and beg for relief of Middle-earth. Earendil came before the powers of Arda, and Earendil went into Valinor and the halls of Valinor, and never again set foot upon the lands of man. Then the Valar took counsel together, and they summoned Ulmo, that's the Valar who controls the oceans, from the deeps of the sea, and Earendil stood before their faces and delivered the errand of the two kindreds, that's elves and men. Pardon he asked for the Noldor, and pity for their great sorrow, and mercy upon men and elves, and succor in their need. And his prayer was granted. The Valar decide to go to war. They decide to march east and go to war against Melkor, the fallen member of their own kind. Of the march of the host of the Valar to the north of Middle-earth little is said in any tale, for among them that went, none of those elves who had dwelt and suffered in the hitherlands, and who had made the histories of those days, are still known. And tidings of these things they only learned from long afterwards from their kinsfolk in Aman. But at the last the might of Valinor came up out of the west, and the challenge of the trumpets of Eonwe, that's one of the Valar, filled the sky, and Beleriand was ablaze with the glory of their arms. For the host of the Valar were arrayed in forms young and fair and terrible, and the mountains rang beneath their feet. The meeting of the host of the west and of the north is named the Great Battle, or the War of Wrath. There was marshalled the whole of the power of the throne of Morgoth, and it had become great beyond count, so that Angvalith could not contain it, and all the north was aflame with war. But it availed him not. The Balrogs were destroyed, save some few that fled and hid themselves in caverns inaccessible at the roots of the earth. And the uncounted legions of the orcs perished like straw in a great fire, or were swept like shriveled leaves before a burning wind. The powers of the west have complete victory. And Morgoth, that's Melkor, is totally defeated, chained, and then thrown beyond the gates of night into the netherworld, from which he can never return. And his iron crown that he was wearing the Silmarils in is beaten into a collar around his neck, and the Valar take the two remaining Silmarils into their keeping. And believe it or not, even though it's a relief undreamt of, unlooked for, that the evil that has oppressed the world for so long has been completely defeated by the powers out of the West, who were largely considered mythological up at this point. Even in the face of all that, the two remaining sons of Feanor demand the Silmarils. They are driven by their oath, even to demand them of the gods themselves. That, yes, you have defeated Melkor, yes, you have saved the entirety of Arda, but the Silmarils are ours. We demand them back. And Eonwe, who is one of the Valar, says, But Eonwe answered that the right to the work of their father, which the sons of Feanor formerly possessed, had now perished, because of their many and merciless deeds, being blinded by their own oath, and most of all because of their slaying of Dior and the assault upon the havens. The light of the Silmarils should now go into the west, whence it came in the beginning. This underscores something that we have seen in the Silmarillion all along, which is that the sons of Feanor are not just driven by an oath, they're also the bad guys. They're thoroughly evil. And they don't deserve any kind of noble treatment. It's lucky for the people adjacent in their orbit, people like Galadriel, that their evil isn't totally communicable, or there'd be no hope for any of them. But the two remaining sons of Fëanor, one of them actually thinks, well, maybe now is the time. Maybe we are released from our oath. If the Valar themselves are saying that we are, then maybe it doesn't count anymore. He says, if Manwë and Varda themselves deny the fulfillment of an oath to which we named them in witness, is it not made void? But it doesn't matter. And they take the Silmarils and eventually come to ill. They come to grief. And that ends the story of the Silmarils. That ends the Silmarillion proper. But there are still two parts left in the book that we're reading today. And the first part is the Akallabeth. And that is a brief history of Numenor, the great mortal men realm of Numenor that eventually rose to enormous power. The Numenorians are mortal men, but they have very long lifespans and very commanding attitude. And at one point, the kings of Numenor decide that they don't like this Sauron guy, a lieutenant of Melkor who was left on Middle-earth and who is amassing power of his own, including the One Ring. They don't like him. They don't like him putting on airs like that when Numenor is the ruler of all the world, exactor of tribute for men do not like the coming of Numenorians in their beautiful ships. Men don't like that. The Numenorians are oppressors. And the Numenorians don't like Sauron being out there, and they make war on him, and Sauron willingly goes to the kingdom of Numenor as allegedly a prisoner, but really he expects to bend them to his will and get them to make war on the Valar. And eventually he succeeds, and they do. And it doesn't go well, of course. The world is completely destroyed. The gods decide to separate Valinor forever from the realm of men. It's not a case any longer of what you can no longer do what Earendel did. You can no longer sail west and get there. You have your passage has to be mystical. It can't just be mortal. It can't be that you equip a ship and you get there. That happens in the Akallabeth. The gods leave the world. But before they do, they destroy a large part of it, including Numenor. Numenor is the myth of Atlantis. Numenor is completely washed beneath the water, completely destroyed. It brings out the poet in Tolkien when he describes the destruction of Numenor and its high temple of Men-el-Tarma. In an hour unlooked for by men, this doom befell, on the 39th day since the passing of the fleets. Then suddenly fire burst from the Men-el-Tarma, and there came a mighty wind and a tumult of the earth, and the sky reeled, and the hills slid, and Numenor went down into the sea, with all its children, and its wives, and its maidens, and its ladies proud, and all its gardens, and its halls, and its towers, its tombs, and its riches, and its jewels, and its webs, and its things painted and carven, and its laughter, and its mirth, and its music, its wisdom, and its lore. They vanished forever. That is a very old-timey type thing to list like that. It's a very Homeric way of telling the story. And that is the end of Numenor. There are a handful of survivors, Earendel and a couple of other shipfuls of Numenorians survive and go to Middle-earth and eventually become the Dunedain. They eventually become the people of Aragorn. And that is why this is the explanation, not only for why Aragorn is so old when Lord of the Rings is taking place. We learned from the appendices in Lord of the Rings that Aragorn is 80 years old in Lord of the Rings, and it doesn't affect him at all. He has the long lifespan of the Numenorians. But it also explains why Aragorn is the way he is, why he's so formidable. So much more than most of the other mortal men that we meet in Lord of the Rings, because he's a Numenorian, basically. But that isn't the end of the Silmarillion. We get the Akallabeth, the downfall of Numenor, and we get the forging of the One Ring and all of the other rings of power. We get basically that story. But then there follows another thing, the final part of the Silmarillion, which I have always thought is just amazing. It is called On the Rings of Power and the Third Age. And it tells the story of the Third Age, not just the beginning of the Third Age, when Sauron is a broken, formless spirit, and when nevertheless evil is growing in the world, and it looks like Sauron and the Nazgul may be regaining strength and power, and around that time, from the west comes to the world of Middle-earth yet more help from the gods. They won't come themselves anymore. Their realm is not approachable anymore. But they send the Istari, they send the wizards to help, among whom are Saruman and Gandalf. So we get not only that is the beginning of the Third Age, but we then get the height of the Third Age and the end of the Third Age. We get the war with Sauron. We get, in other words, the story of the Lord of the Rings told in a few pages instead of a few thousand pages. It's amazing. It's Tolkien deciding to take the story of the Lord of the Rings and tell it in analytic form. In other words, with no dialogue, almost no dialogue, and almost no detail. And that is incredible. We're told that... let me get one part of what I'm talking about here. Frodo the Halfling, it is said, at the bidding of Mithrandir, took upon himself the burden of the One Ring and its destruction. And alone with his servant, he passed through peril and darkness and came at last, in Sauron's despite, even to Mount Doom. And there into the fire where it was wrought he cast the great ring of power, and so at last it was unmade and its evil consumed. The servant is not named. The servant is not named. All of the drama of the story of Sam and Frodo is not even alluded to. We have no idea of the details from that. Gollum is not named. King Theoden and his death on the Battle of Pelennor Fields is not named. The assault on Helm's Deep is not named. It's all done from 30,000 feet. It's amazing. It always makes me wonder what other stories would be like if, as an appendix, their author decided to tell them that way. How much fine-grained detail would be left out? And also, how much fine-grained detail would be unknown to the person who is telling the story? The story here is being given as it was known in the annals of the elves who passed down this information. And some of the details are wrong, as you would expect if you're not on the ground telling the story person by person, minute by minute. Like, for instance, we're told about the Palantirs, the seeing stones that come out of Numenor, that are salvaged from Numenor. These stones were gift of the Eldar to Amandil, the father of Earendel, for the comfort of the faithful of Numenor in their dark days, when the elves might no longer come to that land under the shadow of Sauron. They were called the Palantiri, those that watch from afar, but all those that were brought to Middle-earth long ago were lost. We know from reading Lord of the Rings that isn't true. But the writer who is compiling the annals here does not know that, and presumably does not know any of the details. Imagine, you get the story of the destruction of the One Ring without any of the fine-grained detail, without Legolas and Gimli, without the Council of Elrond, without Tom Bombadil, without Éowyn. I am no man. All of those details are left out because instead you're getting the analytic treatment the same way you've got the rest of the Silmarillion. And that not only makes me wonder, as we end our read-along here, that not only makes me wonder, I've always wondered, what other fantasy epics, or even just works of fiction, would be like if the writer wrote an appendix in which they wrote the story that way. Okay, now tell me that story from 30,000 feet with no fine-grained details, as though you were entering it in a historical annal. How much would be left out? Not only that, I've always thought that about the Rings of Power in the Third Age, but also, what does that say about the rest of the Silmarillion? What does that say about so many of the stories in here that are told in that way? It makes me all of a sudden wonder, to read between the lines and wonder, okay, well, what stories I'm not seeing here? In any of these stories, in any of the stories that we've read, most of them are told from that 30,000-foot analytic viewpoint. What if you were to go back to those stories and read them like Lord of the Rings? How much more could you put in them? I wasn't, the first time that I read this, I wasn't expecting that at all. I have no idea why it's included here, and I loved it. Absolutely loved it. That all of a sudden you're getting the story of the Lord of the Rings that everybody knows so well from a completely different viewpoint. With all sorts of stuff that we would, if you were to talk about Lord of the Rings, if you were to break it down in conversation, I'd say the first 7 out of 10 things that you would mention are not included in that 2-page summary. Because the archivist didn't think they were important. I just love it. And that ends the Summer of the Silmarils. That ends our reading of the Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. A acquired taste as a reading experience, a different kind of reading experience. You do not have character growth like Aragorn or Sam or Frodo or Gandalf. You don't have character growth like that, mainly because this is a story that's taking place over centuries, that's inhabited by characters who are most of them, I mean not the dwarves and not the men, but most of the characters, be it Sauron and Melkor or the Noldor, the elves, the Sons of Fëanor, are living that whole time. And presumably are going, presumably even the Sons of Fëanor have whole decades, maybe even multiple decades in a row, where all they're doing is hunting and feasting and nursing their grudges. But nothing else is happening. We know that long stretches of time go on in the Silmarillion where essentially nothing is happening. Tolkien has already told us earlier in the Silmarillion that the narrative of good things and pure things and beautiful things is boring. It's only when they become endangered or are destroyed that they become worthy of narration. So even if Tolkien had wanted to tell this story in the manner of Lord of the Rings, he couldn't have done it. The time frame is too long, and the characters aren't human. So they're living throughout it all. So you have to get used to that. If you're going to read the Silmarillion, you have to get used to that. You have to make your peace with that fundamental difference in narrative before you move on. I think once you do that, you can really get involved in, I love the epic sweep of the thing. I think it's a sign that a lot of readers have difficulty making that change. I think one indication you have of that is the popularity of stories like Turin Turambar or especially Beren and Luthien, where the time frame is contained and there are characters. Whereas with a lot of the rest of the book, it's not so easy to do that. I think that accounts for why those sections are so popular. But I had a blast. I've had a blast also learning the reactions here in the Summer of the Silmarils. David Wiley has read this book before, and Scott Danielson hasn't. So I got a chance to see completely different perspectives. That was a lot of fun. So I'm hoping that our Tolkien read-alongs continue. I will at them, as the kids say, to try and get a Tolkien read-along going for something else. That would be a lot of fun. The Unfinished Tales, for instance. But one way or another, that wraps up the Summer of the Silmarils. Thank you all for joining. If you read the Silmarillion with us, that was a lot of fun. And we'll see. I'll leave a link to Scott and David's videos. I think theirs are probably up already. Mine would ordinarily be up on a Monday, but I'm not slacking this weekend. So you're actually getting all of my videos on Sunday, the way you should. Don't know what we'll do on Monday. I'll just turn the camera on and twiddle my thumbs. Now, there's a suspicion that I'll have bookish things to talk about. So I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.